In this video, we're going to look at the general overview of the concept of evolution, as well as delve into briefly some of the major mechanisms that drive evolutionary changes. And finally, we're going to look at some complications that limit adaptive evolution. All of this will give us a nice overview so that we can cover this in more detail in class. So, before we start talking about evolution and mechanisms of evolution more specifically, I wanted to just talk about the definition of the term population. This is something we have talked about previously. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. So they're all from one species and they are interbreeding. Over many generations, the composition of a population or the features within a population will change, and this change is what we call evolution. So evolution is simply change within a population over time. Now there's many different things that can cause populations to change over time. One of them is something called artificial selection. This is selection, this is changes that are imposed by human choice. And so, for instance, we've done selective breeding of dogs to end up with many different breeds of dogs. So you have dogs such as Great Danes, that are huge. You have dogs such as little dachshunds, which have really short, stumpy legs. How this happens is through conscious choice of humans. Humans will take individuals with desirable traits and only allow them to breed. Their offspring will then have those desirable traits, and by continuously doing this, picking amongst the individuals for the ones that have traits that you prefer, and only allowing those to breed and preventing the others from breeding, you end up modifying their biology in some ways to lead to features that you desire. So for instance, this graphic shows that dogs with some variation, some with longer legs and some with shorter legs, if you only allow the short-legged dogs to breed and you prevent the long-legged dogs to breed, the next generation is going to have mostly short-legged dogs. But even amongst that second generation, you'll have some with longer and some with shorter legs. So again, if you only allow the shortest legged dogs to breed, the next generation on average has shorter legs than the previous, and you keep doing this over several generations and you end up with dogs with very short legs. So compare the final generation, the dachshunds, to generation 1, and they're dramatically shorter legs, but this did not happen in one generation of breeding. This happened through several generations of selective breeding. So this is artificial selection. This is where we actually select the individuals that are doing the breeding. Now, a slight modification of this could be considered natural selection in a manipulated environment. We can actually manipulate environments so that only some individuals are able to breed. Although we don't force certain individuals to breed, we can make it so that certain individuals are likely to survive and therefore have the ability to breed on their own. So here's an example of an experiment that has looked at changing environmental conditions and how that might impact populations over time. So alcohol can be metabolized by fruit flies. Some flies, some individual flies, will naturally have a higher ability to metabolize alcohol. If they are exposed to alcohol, they're going to survive just fine. However, those with lower ability to metabolize alcohol will actually have some toxic effects of that alcohol, and it will make them less likely to survive. So, two environments. One, where you've grown these flies in normal laboratory environments, you have individuals occasionally in that environment with higher alcohol metabolism levels, about 10%, and that doesn't vary much from generation 1 to generation 57. On the other hand, if you grow these flies in a high alcohol environment, although you have 10% high alcohol metabolizing fruit flies in generation 1, by the time you get to generation 57, you end up with 100% high alcohol metabolizing flies. And the reason for this is that flies that could not metabolize that alcohol were not as successful. They were not able to reproduce. They might have died before they had the ability to reproduce, and therefore those 10% of flies that could already metabolize alcohol were more successful at reproduction, and over many generations their offspring became the dominant or predominant individuals in that population. So we can see that by modifying environmental conditions in the lab, we can actually cause evolution or change in populations to happen. The percentage of alcohol metabolism in fruit flies dramatically changed within 57 generations. So we can cause this through directly choosing which individuals mate. We can also cause evolution by manipulating environmental conditions. Now we're going to see how this can happen without direct human manipulation in a natural environment, something that's going to be true natural selection. Now, a lot of our understanding of how evolution through natural selection occurs was developed through the work of Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin lived in the 1800s. He was 22 in the 1830s, and at that time he went on a voyage on a ship called the Beagle. And during that voyage, he saw many parts of the world. The boat sailed around South America, it sailed around Australia, Africa, and then back to Europe. And he noticed many examples on his voyage of something called adaptation. What adaptation is when an organism has a feature that makes them very well suited to the environment they live in. So for example, here's some examples of adaptation that Darwin saw on his voyage were these finch species found in the Galapagos Island. So on the left is a cactus-eating fish. This finch, this species feeds on cactus or feeds on things that are growing on the cactus, and they have a beak that is very well suited to the tough skin of the cactus, very well suited for avoiding the spiny protuberances on the cactus and allow it to be very successful at cactus eating. Whereas on the right, you have an insect-eating finch that has a smaller, thinner beak that's really good for either digging insects out of tree bark or for catching insects as it flies around in the air. He noticed that on islands with lots of cacti, he would find more cactus-eating morphologies, whereas on islands with more insects and less cacti, he'd find more insect-eating beak morphologies. And so he found adaptation, so species that had features that make them very successful in the environment that they're found in. Okay, so he noticed these features, and this led him to a hypothesis called the hypothesis of natural selection driving evolution. So what I'm going to do now is talk about 4 observations that Darwin made along his voyage, and then some inferences that led him to this understanding of how evolution through natural selection occurs. So first off, he noticed that when he looked around at populations, so again, these are groups of interbreeding individuals within one species, they didn't all look the same. So they varied. So you had snails that could breed with each other, but not all the snails had the same color shell or the same size shell. There was variety amongst organisms, and we noticed this in every group of organisms that he came across on his voyage. He also reasoned that this variation could be passed on from parent to offspring, so those traits are inherited. So a snail with a light-colored shell would most likely have offspring with light-colored shells, whereas a snail with a large shell would often have offspring that had large cells. So traits could be inherited. So traits varied, traits could be inherited. He also noted that species were able to produce a lot of offspring, far more offspring than their environment could possibly support. So they're able to produce an enormous number of offspring throughout their lives. And then going along with this observation, some of them are not going to survive because there aren't enough resources. So there might not be enough food, there might not be enough space. Some of the organisms are not going to survive. So again, there's variation. That variation is able to be passed from parent to offspring. Or organisms are able to produce more offspring than can survive, and therefore some of those offspring are going to not survive. So this led him to two inferences. One, he reasoned that because of this variation, some individuals are going to have traits that give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing, therefore, in a certain environment. Because they're more likely to survive and reproduce, they're more likely to have offspring or have children. Individuals that had other traits will most likely not survive and therefore not reproduce. So some individuals are going to survive and reproduce at a high rate and others at a lower rate. Because of this, the subsequent generation is going to have more individuals with those traits that led to survival, and will have less individuals with traits that did not aid in survival. So with each subsequent generation, we get more and more individuals with these desirable traits and fewer individuals with these less desirable traits. And this leads to changes in population composition. So this is what we call natural selection. It's a process where some individuals survive and reproduce at a higher rate than others. Now keep in mind, these individuals are not changing within their own lifetime. So individuals are not evolving, but the population composition is evolving. Populations are changing. So generation 1 had a large variety of individuals, whereas after each subsequent generation, you get fewer and fewer individuals with the undesirable traits and more individuals with desirable traits. So this is the concept of natural selection driving evolution. Now, through this process, you end up with differential success in reproduction. And because of this, it leads to adaptation. So features that make you successful will help you survive. You'll pass on those features to your offspring, and therefore those features will become more common in the next generation. Now keep in mind, natural selection cannot act on traits that are acquired. So for instance, this bodybuilder has large muscles, they will not automatically have children with large muscles. So natural selection only acts on traits that you can pass on to your offspring, not traits that you acquired throughout your lifetime. Even though those traits that you acquired might help you reproduce at a greater rate, it doesn't mean that those traits that you've acquired will become more common in the next generation. Another consequence of natural selection is that it's entirely dependent on environment. So different environments will have different adaptations be more successful. And if two populations are subjected to different environmental conditions, natural selection will cause them to differentiate over time. So for instance, here's an environment. One environment has dark colored background. Another environment has a light colored background. Now, mice with dark colored coats will survive very well in the dark environment, but not so well in the light environment. So a feature that is an advantage in one environment might be a disadvantage in the other environment. Over time, the dark furred mice will do very well in the dark environment, and the light furred mice will do very well in the light environment. And you'll see divergence in those populations. You'll have fewer dark fur mice in the light environment and fewer light furred mice in the dark environment. Okay, now we've talked about natural selection. So this is features that allow you to be successful, becoming more common over time, driving evolution. But there are other mechanisms that drive evolution. So populations can evolve even if there are no selective pressures. And one of the major ways that populations can evolve without selective pressure is through something called genetic drift. Genetic drift is random changes in frequency of certain genes, which leads to random changes in features that are controlled by those genes. Now, this is most likely to impact small populations, and we'll look at this in more detail in class. So small populations tend to be subject to random drift at a higher rate than large populations. And this is due to just random sampling of alleles. Now, this occurs when none of the features are particularly an advantage, and none of the features are particularly a disadvantage. So for example, here's a population of flowers, some of which are red, some of which are white, and some of which are pink. Now let's imagine that the flower color plays no role in survival, no role in making them more or less likely to be pollinated, no role in giving them an advantage or a disadvantage, but just through random chance, the ones that are highlighted here reproduce. So we have one red flower, one white flower, and 3 pink flowers that are able to reproduce, and just by random chance, the other ones did not. Now we started with 70% red alleles and 30% white alleles, and after this reproductive event, we end up with even split, half red and half white. Now let's say in this generation, by chance, only the red flowers reproduce and none of the other flowers tend to end up reproducing. In this case, generation 3, we end up with only red flowers, 100% red, and white has actually gone away. So this is most likely to happen in small populations, because large populations, random chance leading to dramatic changes in gene frequency is less likely, just because you have so many more possible mating encounters. Small populations tend to be much more subject to this, and we'll look at that again in more detail in class. So again, just to summarize genetic drift, it's random. It's significant to small population. It's really easy for something to be over or underrepresented. So think about flipping a coin. It's random whether you get heads or tails. If you flip it twice, you could easily get heads twice. But if you flip it 100 times, chances are you're not going to get heads 100 times. So smaller populations, you lead to greater chance of genetic drift. It causes allele frequencies to change at random. It can easily lead to loss of variation. So quick loss of variation. As we saw in the last slide, we got red and white went away. You could easily have had the opposite happen. It can also cause harmful things to become fixed, which is a really interesting thing. So remember, natural selection, harmful genes tended to go away because they made the organism less successful at reproduction. But genetic drift is random. So you could randomly have a harmful allele become very common and loss of an actual successful feature through just random mating. So this is why small populations are at high risk of harmful genetic conditions. And we've seen this many times, and we'll talk about some examples in class. So if genetic drift can cause rapid evolution and random evolution, one way that we could counteract genetic drift is through another concept called gene flow. So gene flow is where organisms from one population move into another population, bringing with them their genetics. So in this graphic here, we have a population of white rabbits, population of black rabbits. As one of those white rabbits migrates into the black rabbit population, it brings with it its genes, and it brings with it that white fur color gene. It now gets added to the black rabbit population. Now, what this will do is it will make those two populations more similar and cause them to become lessen the differences between the two. It can also introduce novel genes into a population, which, if successful in that population, if selected for by, say, natural selection, could cause them to become common fairly rapidly. So gene flow also is somewhat random, and it's random which individual migrates and whether or not that individual is successful in reproducing in the new population. So of these three, of natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow, the only one that constantly or consistently causes adaptive evolution is natural selection. The other ones are completely random. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about adaptive evolution. So adaptive evolution is why we see some really neat features in organisms that seem almost so complex that it's hard to imagine them coming about. So adaptive evolution leads to advantageous traits becoming really common in a population and can lead to organisms having these really neat features, like this frog that can spread out its feet and actually glide, like this plant that can actually capture insects and eat them, or like this fish that can actually shoot water from its mouth to knock insects over nearby branches, called an anglerfish here. So there's some really interesting features that evolve through adaptive evolution. So remember, this is through natural selection. It's the only one that is not random. However, it doesn't result in perfect matches. So you often get features that don't seem to be perfectly matched to their environment. And there's some reasons for this, is that natural selection is constrained by several things. Lack of genetic variation, evolutionary history, and finally, ecological trade-offs. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is briefly talk about these three factors. So genetic variation. Basically, what this means is that if the feature is not there, evolution can't act upon it. Or natural selection can't act upon it. So if there's no variation, we can't have adaptive evolution. So natural selection does not come up with new features. It does not introduce new features. It simply selects features from amongst the ones that are already present to increase the occurrence of advantageous features. So, for instance, mosquito populations. If mosquito populations do not contain any pesticide-resistant individuals, pesticides are going to be very effective. They're going to kill all the mosquitoes. However, if there happens to be one or two mosquitoes that have a mutation that leads them to be pesticide resistant, natural selection can select for those features. So natural selection doesn't cause new features to come about. Those features have to be there in the first place by chance and not on demand. So we're going to talk about mutation and how mutation can lead to novel features, which then can be acted on by natural selection, but those features have to be present in the first place. The second thing that constrains natural selection is evolutionary history. So natural selection, again, works on traits that are already there. It can't bring back traits that have been lost, and it can't work on things that aren't present. So organisms have been shaped through their ancestry, and they have features that they have because of all of the natural selection processes that have occurred in their ancestry. So for example, marine mammals. So marine mammals, it would be much more efficient for a whale to have gills and be able to breathe, get oxygen from the water. However, because the ancestors of a whale were a terrestrial mammal, they have lungs, so they can't breathe underwater, so whales have to come to the surface and breathe. Now, their physiology has been modified through many, many years of selective pressures so that they don't have the same features as their ancestors anymore, but they're not able to redevelop gills because gills were lost in the transition to land. So they're constrained by their evolutionary history. We also see things like locations of different organisms are constrained by their evolutionary past. And this is why things like we don't have penguins growing naturally in the northern hemisphere. We don't have polar bears growing in the southern hemisphere. And that's simply because they evolved in those environments. So organisms might be able to survive in environments they're not in, but they can't get there. And that's because they evolved in the environment they're in now. And the final constraint to adaptive evolution is something we call ecological trade-offs. This is something we're going to talk a lot about in class over the next few units. This is the concept that oftentimes the ability to perform one function reduces the ability of an organism to perform another function. So for instance, this is a graph from a study on female deer. Female deer that reproduce have lower survival rates. So the red line are females that don't reproduce, and they live fairly well until about age 13, in which point they start to have higher mortality rates. However, females that reproduce have lower mortality rates throughout their lives. The stress of reproduction, there's increased chances of predatory success, there's increased demand for food, so it becomes much harder for a deer to survive if they are reproductive. So they're trading off reproduction for survival. And so you'll notice that there are certain times that they might be more likely or have less of an impact of this, which means there might be times that they're more likely to reproduce. So you'll notice that at age 7 and 8, there's not such a large decrease in survivorship for reproductive females as there would be at age 3 or age 12. So oftentimes adaptations are a compromise. So one feature will aid the organism in one sense, but will be a hindrance in another sense. And when we get to things like behavioral ecology, we'll see some dramatic examples of this. For instance, peacock feathers. They increase their success at reproduction, but dramatically decrease their success at surviving predators. So there's a trade-off there, and they're going to be constrained on both ends by evolution through natural selection. So again, there are several different mechanisms that can drive evolution. We talked about natural selection, we talked about genetic drift, we talked about gene flow. Of those, the only one that consistently causes adaptive evolution is natural selection. We're going to be exploring all of these mechanisms in more detail in class, but this was just a general overview to get you started.